Hello and welcome to the wild world of wounds. This month, why won't my wounds heal already? What's up with that? So, there are a lot of reasons why wounds don't heal. But what we're going to do in this part one of why wounds don't heal is go through some general broad categories. We'll try and bring it home with part two, but I want you to remember that each of these are just general categories of why wounds don't heal, and each one of these subjects could be a discussion in and of themselves. But I think it's worthwhile taking a broad overview. So that's what we're going to do. We'll go through this and we'll see why is it that wounds don't want to heal sometimes. So what factors affect wound healing? Well, obviously, the mechanism of how a wound occurred can affect how quickly it heals. Contaminated, rabid monkey bites heal slower than clean knife wounds while I'm cutting my bagel. That comes from the Journal of Duh, by the way, but even though it does, it's worth mentioning that mechanism plays a role. Just like from that same journal of Duh, larger wounds will heal slower than smaller wounds. But what else is interesting is the shape of the wound matters. So linear wounds, as you can imagine, it's very easy for those to come together, and those are the fastest to heal. Square wounds heal slower than linear wounds, and circular wounds heal slower than square wounds. Hexagon wounds, no, I'm just kidding. Temperature. All right, so temperature actually plays a role as well. So it's interesting that wounds that are kept at normal body temperature, 37 to 38 degrees Celsius, have improved healing. And I also think it's really interesting that chronic wounds tend to be cooler. And we actually take temperature into account when we're deciding on dressings and how often dressings are going to be changed and how often that wound is going to be open and exposed to the environment. Because each time we do that, we know the temperature of the wound cools off, and it can take quite some time to reach body temperature again. So what about moisture? Moisture plays a role as well. So dry wounds heal slower than moist wounds. And that's because epithelial cells cannot migrate across a desiccated, dry, desert-like wound bed. What they would have to do is actually burrow under that wound bed to re-epithelialize that wound. And as you can imagine, that takes more time and more energy. At the same time, overly wet wounds can macerate the peri-wound region and can slow down healing. So we want a proper moisture balance. That moisture in the wound bed, by the way, can actually also be beneficial because it could contain growth factors that can stimulate further collagen synthesis when you're trying to heal the wound. So what about the actual tissue in the wound itself, the wound bed? Does that matter what that tissue type is? And of course it does. So necrotic tissue in the wound can lead to excess or prolonged inflammatory phase of wound healing. And wounds that are stuck in that inflammatory phase can't progress to the next phase of wound healing, the proliferative phase. So this can also, besides slowing down the progression of that wound into the next phase of healing, necrotic tissue can also lead to wound infection, and it requires debridement. We want to get that necrotic tissue out of the wound. Then another thing to think about in terms of the tissue in the wound bed itself is, do we need to biopsy it? Do we have to think about other potential causes of this wound not healing, such as cancer? And cancer can be primary. In other words, it's a squamous cell, and that's the reason we have the wound. Or cancer can develop in an already chronic ulcer. So you can start with this chronic ulcer, chronic inflammation, and part of that ulcer can transform into a malignancy. It's called a Marjolin's ulcer, and it's squamous cell that usually can develop in a previously traumatized or inflamed tissue. And then you want to rule out other causes of the ulcer as well at times with a biopsy, such as calciphylaxis, You might want to look for pyoderma gangrenosum, vasculitis, and we can talk about these things down the road, but we have to think about not only is there necrotic tissue in that wound bed, but what is that wound bed, and do I need to have that biopsied and analyzed further in a non-healing wound? And then, obviously, infection plays a big role in a person's ability to heal. So, again, an infection will prolong that inflammatory phase. It will slow healing. It increases scarring. And then the bacteria in the wound actually compete for nutrients and oxygen and can excrete toxins that are actually directly detrimental and damaging to the tissues. Specific infections to think about besides just an infection in the wound bed or a cellulitis is a potential deep infection, such as a deep fungal infection or underlying osteomyelitis, or maybe a focus of infection, such as infected hardware under that wound, or an infected foreign body, a piece of something that broke off. I didn't remember bumping into that gate, but there's a little piece of wood in there, and until we get that out, it's just not going to heal. Another thing to think about is, how old is this wound? Chronic wounds are different from acute ones. They have higher levels of MMPs, which are proteases, that can break down the tissue that's trying to form. They have higher levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines, and they show increased bacterial load and are just slower to epithelialize. Another aspect of the wound is to look at the edges and to look at what affects the epithelialization. So rolled, thickened edges inhibit epithelialization because those rolled edges, the epithelial cells can't migrate into the wound bed. And those may require debridement to create attached, more beveled wound margins that the epithelial cells can now migrate into. Antiseptics are meant for intact skin. There's no evidence for increased healing when used in a wound, and they can be cytotoxic and can actually impede healing. And this is another reason why some patients, we find, just aren't healing, because they're actually putting substances in their wounds that are impeding their body's ability to heal or that are cytotoxic. And these can include betadine and hydrogen peroxide. Now that doesn't mean they're never used, but we do have to keep in mind that these agents are cytotoxic and can impede healing. So in summary of part 1, I like to think of that mnemonic time. Tissue for T. Is it necrotic? Does it need to be debrided? Do we need to biopsy it? Do we need to think about cancer? I in time is infection. Wound contamination, colonization or infection, osteomyelitis, infected hardware. Do I need to think about a foreign body? M in time can stand for moisture, and again we want that correct moisture balance. If it's too wet, that's going to impede healing, and if it's too dry, that's going to impede healing. And then E in time stands for epithelialization or wound edges. So are they using substances that are actually impeding your body's own ability to heal, like antiseptics, or do the edges appear rolled and thickened and require debridement? All right, so time is our summary for this month. Next month, part 2 of why won't my wound heal already? All right, we'll see you next month. Bye for now.